Hello and welcome back. Thanks for joining. My name is Berit and today I have a kind of recommendations video for you for the 27th of January, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So I thought this might be a good occasion to talk about some books that are about the Holocaust or the Shoah that you might have read or that you might have heard of or that you might not have read or not have heard of. And that I just think shouldn't be forgotten, and I thought that the International Holocaust Remembrance Day would be a good occasion to not forget these texts. So in case you are looking for something to read that is about that time and from that time partly, especially about concentration camps, I have some recommendations for you. I won't give you too many titles though, because I will basically recommend you texts that I have actually read more than once and that I know relatively well. I haven't read a lot of fiction, like newer fiction that takes place during World War II, especially fiction that has the Holocaust as its main topic, because, and I'm sorry if that's an unpopular opinion, I'm kind of not a huge fan of that. I was always interested in reading about what people experienced during that time, and I also always wanted to read about that because I was so shocked already as a child that this kind of violence existed. And my way of doing that was by reading autobiographical texts. And now I don't usually read memoirs at all, pretty much. This is like the one exception where I actually prefer to read memoirs over reading fiction. Very quick for some context, I wrote my master's thesis about narrating the impossible and about limitations of narrating when it comes to talking about experiences from the concentration camps and how narratives try to break these limitations, to overcome these limitations, and how they could try to convey what has happened to the people that narrate. So basically, most of the books that I'm going to mention are books that I've read for my master's thesis and or that I've read out of a personal interest for the topic. I want to start with a non-fiction book that is pretty brutal and that gives you an unsparingly detailed insight into how concentration camps worked, and that is The Theory and Practice of Hell by Eugen Kogon. In German, this was published with the title Der SS-Staat. Eugen Kogon was a historian and he was incarcerated in the concentration camp Buchenwald near Weimar in Germany for 6 years. The book kind of explains how concentration camps worked, how they were organized, what was done to the people there, etc. The book is relatively long. It has about 350 pages, I think, and I would recommend to take a few breaks while reading this. And I also want to emphasize that the book really goes into pretty much every detail about a lot of stuff, so you should be aware of that. That you will read stuff that you kind of have to be able to stomach. And I mean, every person is different in what they can tolerate when they read and what they maybe cannot tolerate. And that book is pretty to the point and, as I said, very detailed. But it is an interesting book if you want to have a non-fiction, mostly non-narrative book about how the system of the concentration camp was organized and how it worked. When it comes to memoirs, I want to recommend a book that I would almost consider as like the memoir about Auschwitz, and that is If This Is a Man by Primo Levi. The US title of that is Survival in Auschwitz. The book is relatively short, but it is so impressive on so many levels. There are also several intertextual references that are pretty interesting, and the narrative style of the memoir is both kind of quiet and distant, but also, in my opinion, kind of haunting. It was originally written shortly after 1945, but it wasn't published for a bigger audience until the middle of the 1950s. And this is actually a book that I personally think everybody should read. But I also want to recommend another title by him, which is The Drowned and the Saved. This is more analytical in nature in that it is not a memoir. The memoir itself is in a way also very analytical. I would basically recommend everything that Primo Levi has written, but if you haven't read anything by him at all before, then I would say you should start with If This Is a Man, and then continue from there. Another memoir that I want to recommend is one that I don't think has been published in English. So here comes the German title. Ich muss erzählen, mein Tagebuch 1941 bis 45. And that means about I have to tell, or rather I have to report my diary 1941 to 1945 by Mascha Rolnikaite. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, from Lithuania. This is an autobiography of Mascha, who was 13 when the Nazis invaded and occupied the Soviet Union. And she was sent to live in the ghetto of Vilnius for 3 years before she was deported to the concentration camp Stutthof, that is near Gdansk in Poland, when she was 16. And I think she was the only person from her whole family who survived. She had to memorize large parts of her diary because she was very afraid of what was going to happen should anybody find out that she was taking notes and basically writing a diary. So she wrote a lot on bits and scraps of paper, and she memorized those texts before she could write it down as a diary to get published. And I think the publication history of that diary is pretty interesting because I have read that she at first could only publish an abbreviated version in the Soviet Union after the war, because she also talks about the topic of collaboration in Lithuania, which was a topic that the Soviet Union government didn't quite want to publish a lot about. So she first couldn't publish the whole text, and then it only got published later. Now we are kind of stepping over into the fiction section of the video, and when it comes to fiction that is kind of autobiographically influenced, I want to recommend the novels by Imre Kertesz, a Hungarian writer who only passed away a few years ago, and who also got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2002. And I specifically want to recommend his best-known novel, which also was his first novel, which is called Fateless or Fatelessness. I think it was published under both titles. This is a novel about a teenager whose name I cannot pronounce. I think it's Eugen Kogon. I don't know. He's deported from Hungary to actually more than one concentration camp. I think he is first in Auschwitz, and then he gets deported from there to Buchenwald. And the novel is a bit special in my opinion because its atmosphere is quite weird sometimes, I think. And it's a bit different from memoirs and other more explicitly autobiographical works. In fact, the author himself said that this novel is not autobiographical at all. It was published in 1975 and it was initially rejected for the reason that he was kind of too late with that subject, to which Imre Kertesz noted in a diary that when I'm thinking of a new novel, I always think of Auschwitz. I read that Imre Kertesz was a kind of controversial figure for different reasons, and I think that Fateless was also seen as a novel that had a controversial, or let's say confusing, ending. And when I read it, I also wasn't quite sure what to make of it, which I thought was very interesting and very uncomfortable. I generally recommend more of his fiction, but here, as with Primo Levi, I would say start with Fateless, and then if you feel that you want to read more by him, then you can read some of his other works. A very different title that I want to recommend and that I have mentioned on this channel before is the only book that I have on me at the moment, and that is Maus by Spiegelman. This is a classic when it comes to comic books. This is the story of Art Spiegelman's father, who survived the Holocaust and who also was deported to Auschwitz. It treats both the relationship between Art and his father and also the history of his father, which kind of explains why he is the way that he is now and why he has issues with different things. And the comic book was very revolutionary in a way because it was one of the first comic books that showed that you can treat very serious subjects in good ways, like artistically good ways and meaningful ways in the medium of the comic book. And this is a very impressive comic book to read. So if you are into graphic novels and you haven't read it, but you're kind of interested in historical topics, then I would absolutely recommend you to read it because it is super impressive on so many levels. The visual and verbal narrative strategies, they are so interesting. This was a reading experience that in a way definitely left a mark on me as a person and that I kind of had to digest because it was so impressive. The last title that I want to mention here is a newer novel by a German author, and that is The German House by Annette Hess. This novel takes place in Frankfurt in 1963, and it tells the story of a young woman who starts to work as a translator in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials and discovers quite a bit of dirt in her own family's history and in the history of her country as well. The novel deals a lot with the fact that in Germany, working through what had happened in the time of National Socialism and working through the guilt didn't really start right away in society. And there was actually quite the generational conflict between the first generation that was born after the war and the generation that experienced the war as grown-up people. And that is like one of the main topics of the book. I thought the novel was quite good. Sometimes it was noticeable that the author is originally a screenwriter, and she's a very good screenwriter, I think. But in the novel, it kind of bothered me sometimes, and also not all the characters are super like fleshed out and round. We have some cliches here and there, but I found that I could overlook these flaws very well, and I found the topic really interesting. I did like the narrative style overall, and I thought that it was quite the atmospheric novel. I lived in Frankfurt for 10 years and the novel takes place in Frankfurt, and you have a lot of places there that I knew, so that was also kind of nice to read something that takes place in a city where I have lived. But anyway, the book was also very good for a bunch of other reasons than just the fact that it takes place in Frankfurt. And I would also recommend it if you want to read something that is fiction and that is newer fiction and that is maybe a bit different or a bit newer also and less known than The Reader by Bernhard Schlink, which I guess is quite known now because it was made into a movie with Kate Winslet. Both of the novels even have trials as one of their main topics, but they are kind of different. So yeah, I would also recommend The German House. And that concludes today's video. I hope that you found it interesting, I hope that you liked it, and I hope that I could maybe give you some ideas and titles for books that you might be interested in reading if you want to know more about the Holocaust and especially about concentration camps. I hope that I could give you some new ideas and maybe some new thoughts, and maybe I'll see you in the next one. Bye.